I'm Mahi Ramakrishnan. Over the next few months, you will hear a new perspective on the Voice of Rohingya radio, a program covering Rohingya news we call Where It Happens. As an investigative reporter for 19 years, I've worked with Associated Press, Time Magazine, Al Jazeera, USA Today, and Voice of America. As a Rohingyan descendant, I'm doing my part to shed light on the situation which affects the Rohingya people worldwide. If you like this program, please do subscribe or follow us on Twitter @ForRohingya. We enjoy reading your feedback. For comments or story ideas, send us an email to contact@friendsofrohingya.org. For Voice of Rohingya Radio, I'm Mahi Ramakrishnan, and this is Where It Happens. An opposition Malaysian Member of Parliament, Dr. Ong Kian Meng, branded Prime Minister Najib Razak's statement regarding the humanitarian crisis involving Rohingya refugees as a joke, pointing to the country's bad record in human trafficking. He pointed out that the US State Department's Trafficking in Persons report had downgraded Malaysia to Tier 3 last year for not complying with the minimum standards to deal with human trafficking. As long as the Malaysian government refuses to have an honest examination of its policies towards refugees and migrants, our human trafficking record will continue to languish, Ong said in a statement. In a report by The Guardian, Professor Penny Green says, and I quote, "The Rohingya are faced with two options: stay and face annihilation or flee." Malaysia's local daily The Star reports about a 45-year-old Rohingya man by the name of Din who has been in Malaysia for 24 years, together with his wife, also a Rohingya, and their 7-month-old baby. In 1995, I was detained and sent back to Thailand after a few months. Once I was released, I was immediately sold to a group of fishermen. Those were the worst 2 years of my life, said Din. Meanwhile, Myanmar's government say the Rohingya are not eligible for citizenship under the country's military-drafted 1982 law, which defines full citizens as members of ethnic groups that had permanently settled in modern-day Myanmar prior to 1823. Even the name Rohingya is a taboo in Myanmar, where they are referred to as Bengalis, immigrants from neighboring Bangladesh. Another Malaysian opposition lawmaker, Charles Santiago, has demanded that Prime Minister Najib Razak makes a stand regarding the thousands of Rohingya refugees who are adrift at sea. As a person and head of state, what are you going to do for the Rohingya who are adrift at sea? What are you going to do for the Rohingya whose bodies may wash against our shores if they are not rescued now? Santiago asked in a press statement to the media. Today we have with us Sumitra Viswanathan, head of Women's Aid Organization and an expert on refugee and trafficking issues. She's here to discuss about the impending regional humanitarian crisis brought about by the decision by Malaysia, Thailand and Indonesia to push back thousands of Rohingya boat people to sea. Sumitra, thank you for being with us on the show. Could you please give us a background about the refugee situation on a whole in Southeast Asia?
Well, it's not a new phenomenon. It's something that's been happening for very, very many years. And I remember actually when I first joined an organization that was involved in refugee protection in 1992, I remember being at that office, and at that time the staff there were working on documentation to present to the government, and it was related to the new phenomenon of arrivals of Rohingyas into Malaysia from Myanmar. So that's that situation. And then of course the mid-70s right up to the mid-90s was that whole situation related to the Vietnamese boat people. Okay, there has been for generations movements within this region, and Malaysia really is very much at the crossroads, right? It's the crossroads between South Asia, Northeast Asia, and then so there's always that exchange. So it's actually very dynamic and very vigorous movement of peoples. When you have a disparity in economic situations of different countries throughout the region, you will then, rationally then also have people from countries where job opportunities may not be available who would want to move to other countries where job opportunities are available. The opportunities for legal migration they're just extremely restricted. And because they are restricted, and because governments tend to be so protective of the populations that are currently legally in their own countries, then you open up the avenues for a parallel system of, unregulated, informal, and illegal migratory streams. And when that occurs, then you get the introduction of this very, very difficult issue of abuse and trafficking, smuggling, and so on and so forth. So that's one thing. The other thing that occurs is that in this region, and sometimes not known to many people, there are many, many situations of internal armed conflict. In addition, there's also many, many situations of widespread violations of human rights by governments onto their peoples. So in addition to the economic migration, you have also had, and also for many years, migrations of people who are fleeing persecution, who are fleeing conflict, and they come to places that are considered relatively more secure. That occurs as well. So again, for those kinds of movements, certainly within this region, there is no established and concrete legal framework to allow for those admissions to take place, and also for the protection of the people who are living there in a legal way. So you don't have that occurring. And again, when you do not have that occurring, then you introduce this very difficult issue of abuse and trafficking and smuggling of people who are in need of international protection. So in a nutshell, I think that's probably what the situation is now.
Picking up from what you said, and I think it's very interesting, we have situations like in Burma, where the Rohingya are forced to flee persecution. They take risks and put their lives on the hands of traffickers. Now, what do you think ASEAN as a regional grouping can do to prevent people from fleeing and curb trafficking?
Again, a legal framework is extremely important. Regional political will, a regional process to discuss the establishment of such a framework. So that is the first step that's extremely important. And then from there, individual member states in ASEAN need to then, in the light of that regional framework, to then establish its own procedures and policies locally that would allow for the reception, the protection, and potentially the access to solutions for people who are in need of this kind of protection. That's extremely important. It's been done before. It's important that we all note that it's been done before. It's been done with the Vietnamese. And from 1989 until 1996, the ASEAN countries in this region had such a framework in place. And while there were many, many issues and challenges associated with implementing that initiative, but nonetheless, it was done. It did have a successful resolution. It was multi-layered. It addressed all the different dimensions of that particular movement. It addressed the country of origin, which was Vietnam. It addressed possibilities for resettlement outside of ASEAN. It also addressed this very important issue of reception and care arrangements for asylum seekers and refugees.
Women are seen to be the most vulnerable group of people, whether they are refugees or migrants. And as you know, they very often face abuse at the hands of traffickers. We have many Rohingya women here in Malaysia who were raped at the Thailand-Malaysia border. So what mechanism would you like to see put in place in Malaysia to provide assistance to these women?
Again, the most important thing which everybody needs, right, regardless of your gender or regardless of the abuses that we faced on the way, what you need is a status. You need to have some kind of legal status in the country of asylum that will then allow all these other protective mechanisms to kick in. That's the most important thing. And then as well, yes, it's unfortunate but true that in the refugee experience, it is frequently women and girls who are most at risk. And they are at risk of sexual harm, they are at risk of economic harm, they're at risk of so many different levels of harm. And even within refugee groups, they are also further discriminated against and abused. So when you give someone a status, when you give a woman asylum seeker, a woman refugee, a woman stateless person, some kind of status, legal status in your country, then if she faces those abuses and violations, number one, she could walk into a police station, for instance, and ask for support, ask for protection, ask for a legal response. The other thing that she could do is she could walk into any government shelter, she could come to any non-governmental organization and with the confidence say, I need this assistance because this has occurred to me. She can enter the judicial process, you know. I mean, there are all of the protections that are already in place in Malaysia can then be made meaningful for her. Right now, that's not possible because she has no status in Malaysia.
Thousands of Rohingya men, women, and children are stranded at sea. And according to news reports, they are starving and at least 10 people have died so far. So, how do you think Malaysia's Prime Minister Najib Razak should have responded to this crisis?
You know, even putting aside all the international customary laws and international legal obligations that are currently on Malaysia to do something, even putting all of that aside, there is the basic, fundamental human response to save another person who is about to die. That's basic, right? It's basic, it's about our common humanity. Okay, so that must be done, right? If that's not being done, then the next thing is let's look at what international law compels you to do. The law of the sea is very wide, very complex, and when it comes to international maritime activities, there is a customary international legal obligation on anyone to, if it's within your ability and if it's not going to put you yourself at risk, you have an absolute duty to rescue another person who is in distress at sea. So that is currently not being respected. What is happening is the governments, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, are taking a very restrictive interpretation to distress at sea. Okay, it's unseaworthy boat full of people, no food, no water, floating around aimlessly is not distress. But I think the way they are interpreting distress is, you know, the boat has fallen apart, hundreds of people are in the water and they're drowning. Then they want to go and rescue. Okay, so that is too restrictive and really not within the spirit of the duty to rescue. There's also a whole host of other obligations, like, there is the customary international legal obligation to not return refugees to places where they could be persecuted. So meaning you must admit them, okay? You cannot send them back. So what does that mean? You must admit them. There's also obligations on Malaysia when it comes to CEDAW, because Malaysia is a signatory state to CEDAW. And CEDAW has certain standards when it comes to treatment of women, asylum seekers, refugees, and stateless persons. There's also an obligation on Malaysia when it comes to the Child Rights Convention, and we know there are many children on those boats who are currently at risk of dying. So there are those international obligations, but I think it's also important to recognize that there's also the Malaysian Anti-Trafficking in Persons and Anti-Smuggling in Persons Act. Now that act puts the obligation on the Malaysian authorities. Just as soon as they identify that someone is a victim of trafficking, you must bring that person within a magistrate within 14 days, and that person must be issued with an interim protection order and then be put in a government shelter. That is the obligation under our own domestic legislation, which must be implemented as a matter of priority. And we know every single person on those boats is a victim of trafficking.
Why do you think Malaysia is so reluctant to take them in?
I think there are, the concerns that the government has, I don't think they've changed over the last 25 years, which were, the same concerns that they had with the Vietnamese boat people. And Malaysia has taken the position that it has. I'm sure not because, I'm sure they don't feel comfortable about it, right? Who feels comfortable about letting people die in the sea? But they feel that, I assume they feel that they have hard choices and they're making what is the right choice. But I would argue that it's not the right choice, it's the wrong choice. And the fears, I would imagine, would relate to a fear of attracting an influx. So if they take these boats in, more boats will come. to counter that fear, I would put two things across. And number one, these boats have been coming since 1992, and they're going to keep coming until something changes very fundamentally in Myanmar. And secondly, you know, in the Mediterranean, there is a similar crisis unfolding in the Mediterranean, and people are dying. And Italy in 2012, I think, had started this rescue at sea operation called the Mare Nostrum. They did that, and then they stopped it in 2014 because they felt that the rescue operation itself was acting like a pull factor, in the same, I think, mirroring the concern that Malaysia probably has. So they stopped it in 2014. But from throughout 2014 and up to now, the number of boats have actually increased, not decreased. And the reason they have increased is because the push factor has been so strong. So I would argue that, no, it's not a pull factor, because the push factor from Myanmar is extremely strong.
If Burma adamantly refuses to recognize the Rohingya as its citizens, what other options would ASEAN have to solve this issue?
You know, I think, if I remember correctly, at the time when ASEAN was considering Myanmar's inclusion into ASEAN, there were a lot of discussions also on the issue of the Rohingya. And not just the Rohingya, actually the ethnic minorities who were, who were being placed in situations where they could not continue living in Myanmar and therefore had to leave. And I think there was sort of like an informal understanding, and I believe it was between our government and the Burmese and the Myanmar government, that we would advocate for their inclusion into ASEAN, and the trade-off would be that they would take back the Rohingya. But that clearly has not occurred. So I would call upon the Malaysian government to perhaps take some time to reflect on that, and also to reflect on the declarations that ASEAN has put out, and certainly from the last ASEAN summit, the declarations for cooperation, for burden sharing, for promotion and protection of human rights standards, our international obligations, and so to also reflect on that, and then perhaps to evaluate, do certain evaluations of some members within ASEAN, and then to come to a conclusion whether they have really bought into the ASEAN declaration or not.
Sumitra, that was very informative. Thank you for joining us today. Voice of Rohingya Radio has been brought to you by Friends of Rohingya. Learn more about the Rohingya cause by supporting Friends of Rohingya USA today. Until next time, I'm Mahi Ramakrishnan.